Good morning everyone, how are you all? Can all hear me? All good? I'd like to start obviously by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we meet today, and I'd like to pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present. I'd also like to thank Peak Care Queensland and Lindsay and Gary for inviting me to talk today during Queensland's Cultural Diversity Week. I'd also like to thank Jathinda for her amazing talk. It was fantastic in being comprehensive for all the variables and factors that need to be looked at in this important issue, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Megan and Erica later today. So as you can see, my name is Pooja Sawrikar and I work here at Griffith University, and I give a lecture every Monday morning on research methods right here. So it seems I can't get away from this place. Although this morning of presentations is to talk about the delivery of any kind of service for children and families from CALD backgrounds, I've chosen to focus here today on the delivery of child protection services because it's the area in which I've conducted most of my research. So specifically, I'll be talking about key issues that came out of the postdoctoral study I conducted on culture and child protection in New South Wales between 2007 and 2010. And the point of today's presentation is to see what could be learnt there and applied here to the Queensland context. That research was co-funded by the New South Wales Department of Human Services and the Social Policy Research Centre at UNSW, so I'd also like to acknowledge them for their funding. Okay, as I said before, the main aim of today's presentation is to identify key issues relevant to the provision of culturally appropriate child protection services in communities that are culturally diverse, like Queensland is. And to meet this aim, I will be drawing on results that were obtained from the 3-year study, which was comprised of 3 stages: a literature review, case file reviews, and qualitative interviews. So as you can see, this project used a mixed methods approach, triangulating quantitative and qualitative methodologies, which were then embedded and made sense of in light of the known literature. So with the qualitative interviews, there were 2 groups. The first were with 29 CALD, or culturally and linguistically diverse, client families, so parents or guardians involved in the child protection system. Slight tangential point, in the national and international literature, CALD is synonymous with NESB, or non-English speaking background, and ethnic minority. I don't have enough time to complain today about the term CALD. I actually really don't like it. So I'll just give you a very abridged version for why I think it's problematic. CALD stands for culturally and linguistically diverse, when in fact it is really referring to the culturally and linguistically different, and I don't like the fact that it's not transparent about who it is talking about. There are other issues as well. It's exclusionary to the Anglo majority because it implies that they don't have a culture or a language, and most importantly, it fails to include the dimension of race and therefore racial barriers, which the word ethnicity encompasses. So my preference is for ethnic minority. Okay, with the case file reviews, in total there were 120 case files that were randomly selected, and they come from 6 cultural groups: Chinese, Vietnamese, Lebanese, Pacific Islander, specifically Samoan and Tongan, Aboriginal and Anglo-Saxon or Celtic. And the first 4 of these groups are the ones that are considered to be CALD, and the latter 2 groups were intentionally included in this project to show that culture is not just relevant to ethnic minorities, it's in fact relevant to everyone. I should also add that I won't be going through specific results from these 3 stages, but more key themes that emerged across all of the stages of the study. So if you do want specific results that come out, I'll give you links to the reports that came out of the study for each stage. Obviously, the scope of this topic is far greater than what I can cover in 40 minutes comprehensively. So I've had to really pick out issues that I see to be absolutely critical in this matter. And there are 3 such issues that I think service providers and policymakers need to be aware of when there's a need to provide culturally appropriate child protection services because they work in culturally diverse communities. These are that one, there is an inherent tension between the right to equal protection from harm across different cultural groups and the right to respect cultural differences in parenting and family functioning across different cultural groups. And in the literature, this tension is known as the debate between cultural absolutism and cultural relativism. Secondly, there may be some characteristics that are unique to ethnic minority groups and which caseworkers and case managers need to be aware of to best meet their needs. And finally, that cultural competency is necessary for the provision of culturally appropriate services, but most importantly, that this needs to be implemented at 3 levels: that of the workers, the agencies, and the child protection system itself. So I now want to look at these 3 issues more closely. The first issue is the debate between cultural absolutism and cultural relativism, and this debate really is at the heart of today's presentation. Today's talk is all about how do you protect all children from harm equally when all children come from different cultures and different cultures have different ideas about what's harmful. In other words, are there definitions of harm, abuse, and neglect that are independent of culture by which all children can be assessed regardless of their cultural background? The short answer is no. As Goff and Lynch say, culture is perhaps the most basic issue for child abuse and child protection. It is the context in which children live and something to which they contribute. It is the backdrop against which all circumstances and events affecting children occur. It provides the basis for both our definitions of abuse and neglect and the responses we have developed to protect children and prevent abusing acts from occurring and recurring. In other words, there are no objective tools to assess the safety of children because these assessments are based on culture. This means that we would need as many different assessment tools as there are cultures to accurately assess risk of harm. But if we have many assessment tools, then how can we be assured that all children are being assessed equally? So the issue here is, how can child protection authorities protect all children from harm and yet not mistake culturally normal parenting behaviours as harmful? The debate between cultural absolutism and cultural relativism represents 2 endpoints of a tension that occurs in child protection work in culturally diverse communities. So just to define these terms, cultural absolutism argues that culture and abuse are 2 different things, so they can be distinguished from each other. As a result, abusive and neglectful behaviours can be identified and assessed without having to take culture into account. The other side of the coin, cultural relativism, argues the exact opposite, that culture and abuse cannot be separated, that you cannot identify what abuse or neglect is unless you understand that person's culture. And obviously this issue occurs no matter which country or region you are in. As long as there is diversity in a population, child protection authorities will face this issue. So how do you address it? How do you resolve this tension? The answer is you can't. This tension cannot be simplified or reduced. The only way to address the tension is with education. The debate between cultural absolutism and cultural relativism represents an inherent tension in child protection work in multicultural communities, and an inherent tension, by definition, cannot be resolved. It's inherent. So the best defence against the pitfalls of each point in this tension is to be aware of the risks associated with them, and education and training can provide this awareness. The pitfall of cultural absolutism is that if you judge every family according to one universal standard, then the behaviours of some families that are normal in their culture could be mistaken as abusive or neglectful. Moreover, that universal standard still emerges from a culture, and that culture typically reflects the mainstream or dominant culture. So, for example, in Australia, our majority culture is that of the white Anglo-Saxon group, and assessments of risk and abuse and neglect tend to be measured against what is considered normal in white Anglo-Saxon families, which is not an appropriate yardstick for a Pakistani family, or an Italian family, or a Chinese family. So at its very worst, using a universal standard that most likely reflects the dominance group's values and norms about parenting and family functioning can be seen as a way of trying to assimilate minority groups to be like the majority. In Australia's history, policies of assimilation, as you know, have been overt. Between 1901 and 1973, for example, the government had the White Australia policy, in which non-white families were restricted entry into the country and were explicitly expected to assimilate to the white majority. The worst example is that of the stolen generation, where Aboriginal children were taken from their parents and purposely put with white families with the intention of saving them from their primitive culture. Besides failing to respect the rights of Aboriginals to raise their children according to their cultural values and norms, this strategy for assimilation also left behind an awful legacy of intergenerational brokenness. Aboriginal children did not grow up knowing their parents, their families and communities were broken. As you can see, there are dire consequences to children and families if cultures are not respected in their right to be different from the norms of the mainstream. And ultimately, these consequences are to children themselves. So instead of child protection intervention being protective of children, it is instead harmful, the very thing it's trying not to be. In the words of Peterson and Yick, cultural dimensions do matter when examining the ethics of autonomy. Do not onto others as you would have them do onto you. Their tastes may be different. Having said all this, there are pitfalls with cultural relativism as well. If you use no yardstick by which to assess all children, so there's no one standard that all children can be gauged by, then you could end up coming across a family who is abusing their child, but you, as the Child Protection Authority, mistake it as culturally normal. In this case, the risk is that you fail to protect the child. One of the most dramatic examples of this issue is female genital mutilation, FGM, or female genital cutting. In FGM, parents will arrange for their daughter to have partial or total removal of the external female genitalia. The main cultural reason for the practice is that it helps ensure the young female's virginity at the time of marriage. Thus, it's seen as a culturally responsible act for parents to do, because it's seen as being in the best interests of their daughter. But the practice is also known to cause physical and emotional pain to the young girl, who may even die from the procedure. So while it may be culturally normal and acceptable, that does not necessarily mean that it is not also harmful. So in short, the pitfall for cultural absolutism is that caseworkers and case managers over-intervene and in turn compromise the well-being of children who were otherwise safe. And the pitfall of cultural relativism is that child protection workers may fail to intervene. And so both of these risks can only be avoided, I think, with education and training. The second issue I want to talk about is the fact that child protection authorities need to be aware of characteristics that are specific to ethnic minority groups in Australia. There are a couple of things that characterise the experience of migrant or ethnic minority groups, such as migration stress, acculturative stress, socioeconomic disadvantage, displaced sense of belonging and cultural identity, perceived and actual racism and discrimination, intergenerational conflict due to acculturation, disrupted family dynamics such as reversal of traditional gender roles, low English proficiency, low awareness of institutional systems such as child protection agencies as well as of their statutory power, fear of authority because of past experiences with child protection agencies or other authority bodies in the country of origin, fear of being denied citizenship if they come to the attention of child protection and other authorities, insufficient awareness of local community services that are available, loss or lack of extended family, social and community supports, and post-traumatic stress disorder or other related mental health issues like depression because of traumatic experiences in their home countries. I'd like to point out that there is some overlap with other groups. For example, Indigenous Australians also experience socioeconomic disadvantage and racism and discrimination. And similarly, Anglo-Australians also experience socioeconomic disadvantage. But despite these small overlaps, essentially, this list of characteristics differentiates the experience of ethnic minority groups from their Indigenous and Anglo counterparts. I'd also like to point out that not all ethnic groups experience all of these things. Some may experience more and some may experience less. For example, refugees and asylum seekers would still fit under the global term ethnic minority, but they are in fact a subgroup within that bigger group with their own unique needs and experiences. Despite this within-group diversity, this list is simply to say that these characteristics tend to cluster together for ethnic minority groups. Moreover, and most importantly, any one of these characteristic experiences can disrupt the ability of a parent from a minority group to parent effectively. And so any one of these reasons could explain why their child has entered the child protection system. And this is a crucial point. This is because it's very easy to assume that when a child from a minority group enters the child protection system, it's because of their culture. It is some aspect of their culture that is dysfunctional and why they're in the child protection system. Now, I acknowledge that not everyone would agree, but I would say probably that it's easy to make this assumption because it's human to attribute things to race and culture and ethnicity. The propensity to see race is just so strong in humans that it is difficult to ignore, and it is difficult not to give it a lot of weight. The problem, however, with this is that culture then gets blamed for abusive or neglectful behaviours from parents from these diverse communities, when really it may be attributable to factors such as these, which are in fact all non-cultural. Poverty, racism, social isolation, language barriers, these are not cultural issues. They are artefacts of being different to the mainstream. As Shalhoub Kevorkian says, the power of difference, particularly where one ethnic or racial group is considered inferior in customs, lifestyle and beliefs, is a vital adjunct to the study of child protection. So in short, when workers are aware of characteristic experiences unique to ethnic minority groups, they will be, one, better able to understand their families, better able to engage with them, and perhaps most importantly, they will be less likely to attribute family dysfunction to culture instead of these other non-cultural factors. The final issue that I want to talk about today is cultural competency and the fact that it needs to be implemented at 3 levels: the frontline child protection workers, the locally based child protection agency in which they work, and the child protection institution itself. If culturally competent child protection work is not implemented at all 3 levels, then there are 2 main risks that can emerge. The first is institutional racism. This refers to organisational and institutional policies, practices, procedures and norms that do not take into account cultural diversity and so are not sensitive to cultural differences in their pluralistic society. And the second risk is ineffective or inefficient service delivery. This means that either culture isn't being taken into account appropriately or that it isn't being taken into account sufficiently. In other words, culture is being considered by workers in their practice, but not in the right way, or that it is being considered and in the right way, but only by a few caseworkers and case managers. The issue with the first risk is that some ethnic groups may enter the child protection system because they're being judged by a standard that isn't even applicable to them. And so it looks like they're a highly abusive and neglectful group, but in fact they're actually experiencing institutional racism. So their representation in the child protection system is not actually reflective of the true prevalence of abuse or neglect for that group, but rather policies and practices that are not sensitive to their culture. The issue with the second risk is that some ethnic minority families may be getting a good service, but not all of them are. So there's another systematic disadvantage here in that only a lucky few are receiving a culturally appropriate service because they happen to have a worker that's aware of and sensitive to issues related to cultural diversity. So to avoid these two risks, it's important to deliver a culturally competent practice. So let's start by defining this term, cultural competency. There are lots of definitions of this term in the literature. I've just pulled out 3. One says that qualities of professionals important for minority ethnic families include being sensitive, open-minded, respectful, acknowledging that caseworkers do not always have the answer, seeking advice from independent workers from the same community or faith group or who speak the first language of the family, not appearing arrogant or superior, being open and honest, and being aware of the impact of racism and racial abuse and how to challenge racism. Another says that although cultural competency is often spoken of as a singular entity, it is in fact many different things. Cultural competency most often refers to practice that is geared towards knowledge of and skills in working with cultural groups other than one's own, but it also has a political and activist component in promoting empowerment and inclusion of culturally diverse professionals in decision-making positions. And there remains a diversity of options as to whether the provider and receiver of treatment and prevention be of the same cultural group. And finally, another definition says the effective development of cultural competency lies beyond the efforts of social workers and agencies, and policies and changes to practice are also necessary for an improved culturally competent environment. So as you can see, there are many dimensions to cultural competency. Some definitions place emphasis on the personal aspect of it. So, for example, argue for the importance of keeping a check on personal prejudices. And others stress the organisational or institutional aspects of it. So, for example, argue that the organisational and institutional culture to which diversity is acknowledged and addressed makes a difference. But really, all of these characteristics fall under this umbrella term. And it's for this reason that there are 3 tiers involved in service delivery, and that all are important for the delivery of a culturally competent service. So as you can see, the 3 tiers are that of workers, agencies, and systems. What I've now done is pull together key findings from the literature review, case file reviews, and qualitative interviews and categorised them under these 3 headings. And then under those headings, I've made some recommendations for how each of these 3 tiers can play their part in implementing and maintaining a culturally competent service. And a lot of them will overlap with what Jathinder's already said. Of course, these recommendations emerge from data from New South Wales, but obviously have transferability to the Queensland context. So let's start with the frontline caseworkers and case managers. And I should also add that these lists of recommendations are not exhaustive. They just provide a starting point to help identify relevant resources or models or strategies that could be used. There are 7 recommendations that I'm going to go through at this level. The first is that all staff should receive training in cultural competency. This is because ethnic diversity within a country occurs along a range of variables like language, culture, social background, religion, etc. So it's very likely that caseworkers and case managers are going to be providing services to families who differ in at least some important aspect from their own language or culture or religion, for example. So because of this, responsibility for working with ethnic minority families should not be placed solely on caseworkers who are from ethnic minority backgrounds themselves. In other words, all workers need to be responsible for addressing cultural diversity in their clientele, and so all workers need to receive training in cultural competency. This is even more important because of the second point, which is that some client families may prefer to have a caseworker that is not from the same ethnic background as themselves. So if a family asks for a non-matched caseworker, that caseworker still needs to be able to provide a culturally appropriate service. One of the main reasons why a family may ask for a non-matched caseworker is because they fear that a matched caseworker would breach confidentiality and leak to their community their family's private affairs. This, of course, would then lead to loss of face in the community. To avoid this possibility, they may then ask to have a caseworker from a different background to themselves. Having said that, there are some families who may prefer to have someone from the same background, either because they feel that person will understand their culture better or because they need to for language reasons. So there are good reasons for having a full workforce trained in cultural issues. This way, any caseworker, matched or non-matched, will be able to address any family's needs. There is an additional benefit to non-matching, and that is that it can help address the issue of over-identification. Over-identification occurs when caseworkers normalise what other caseworkers may see as risk of harm because of their familiarity with the culture. The problem with this is that children at risk of harm may be overlooked or the level of harm is minimised. Although this is a significant risk in being able to protect children from harm, over-identification can actually occur for any reason. For example, a caseworker who has been adopted themselves may over-identify in cases of adoption or have mental health issues in a carer, for example. Over-identification can occur for any reason. And for any reason, therefore, colour that caseworker's ability to see specific issues for their specific family. In other words, the risk of over-identification occurs as long as there is a commonality between the caseworker and the client family. For this reason, meeting the request of the family is seen as more important than managing the risk of over-identification. This is because if you can meet the client family's needs first, then they will be more likely to engage with you. And if there is a risk of over-identification, then it should be managed by a competent case manager. A third recommendation is that the use of interpreters should be appropriate. For example, all interpreters should be accredited. Children should never be used as interpreters, but client families should be told that they can have a trusted confidant present when using an interpreter. Also, the gender of the interpreter needs to be considered for matters such as sexual abuse and domestic violence, or because it's culturally unacceptable to have a male interpreter for a female client, or vice versa. More generally, the interpreters should be readily available, are clear about their roles and responsibilities, and can accurately and sensitively communicate with the families so that attention is not swayed away from the child instead of towards managing language issues. Another recommendation is that staff should seek advice and information by consulting with bilingual or multicultural caseworkers or local ethnic advocacy or community groups. In fact, one of the main themes that came out of the qualitative interviews was that there was insufficient consultation with multicultural caseworkers for CALD client families, and that this contributed to low cultural awareness and sensitivity. The other thing is that there are always going to be new and emerging groups in the community and which may enter the child protection system. So it's important to keep cultural knowledge up to date. This can be done by consulting with relevant workers and cultural groups. For example, in Australia, there has been a significant increase in the number of arrivals from African countries in the last 10 or so years, and so they represent a new and emerging group in Australia. It is also important that workers avoid the use of or reliance on negative stereotypes based on preconceptions or beliefs that are fundamentally different from one's own. So it's important to be self-reflective on one's own personal and cultural norms of what is considered to be acceptable parenting, and to make sure that any personal prejudices or biases are not affecting substantiations, assessments and judgments of child abuse or neglect in families different to one's own. Caseworkers should also consider referring their client families to both mainstream and tailored services. The research in Australia shows that if ethnic minority families are referred to universal or mainstream parenting programs like the Triple P, which talks about acceptable forms of discipline, this can help ensure that they're aware that such services are accessible to them in their local community, but it also promotes their sense of inclusion in universal or mainstream services. Having said that, mainstream services may not be sufficient to meet their specific cultural needs, and so it's also important to provide tailored services. One such service identified in the literature is that of family group conferencing, in which families are included in the decision making about the type of intervention that will be implemented. So this is an effective way of developing a culturally appropriate intervention, not just because it's empowering, but because it's sensitive to cultural factors. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, child protection workers should focus on child safety without losing focus on cultural factors. To help avoid swinging between the two ends of the absolutist relativist pendulum, it may be useful to emphasise to the client family that they both have in common a desire to protect the child's welfare, but that the ways in which that is being done needs to change. By using this common ground as the basis for engaging with a family, harmful parenting, despite any well intentions behind the harmful act, can be better addressed. For example, in the case file reviews, it was found that physical abuse was common among migrant groups like Lebanese, Vietnamese, Chinese and Samoan families. So a parent from one of these groups may say that they beat their child for disciplinary reasons and that as such they mean well. But as you know, just because you mean well doesn't mean you do well. So by saying to the family that you, the parent, and we, the child protection workers, have the same desire to do what's best for the child, then you create a common ground that allows you to focus on the harmful act and getting them to change that rather than focusing the discussion on the intentions of parents. This also helps bridge cross-cultural differences in parenting and family functioning, like the use of physical discipline being culturally normal or acceptable in some cultural groups. Okay, now moving on to 8 recommendations for the agencies in which child protection staff work. Firstly, it helps to just improve the overall service of the centre. This can include, for example, the welcoming atmosphere, the ethos of the centre, which promotes user participation, the specific services that the centre offers, and having obviously helpful staff. All of these benefit all families, regardless of their cultural background. It is also important to recruit staff from ethnic minority groups that reflect the local demographic. So for example, if an area in Australia has a high proportion of Lebanese and Vietnamese families, then it seems reasonable and important to have caseworkers from Lebanese and Vietnamese backgrounds represented in the staff profile. As well, employ at least one multicultural caseworker. This person would represent a point of call or a go-to person that can then direct other caseworkers and case managers to any necessary resources or training that they may need. So this person is important because some areas may have clients from many different cultural backgrounds, speaking many different languages, and so it's just not practical or reasonable to expect all caseworkers to be competent in all cultures. So this person can act as a directive of where to go for relevant information. Agencies should also provide training to interpreters so that they are sensitive to child protection issues. As an example, one caseworker who took part in the qualitative interview said, "I've had interpreters cry when one of the family members cry, which just escalates the situation. I signal to her, this is not actually about you, it's about this mum who is obviously very upset about losing her daughter. I've had experiences where interpreters will tell you their whole life story and barely interpret what families are saying." So as you can see, this interpreter inappropriately took away attention from the client family because they themselves were not trained to deal with such sensitive matters. It may be helpful to also develop brief cultural fact sheets for some of the more common ethnic groups in that local community. It would also be useful to invite members of that local community to come into the agency and share their cultural knowledge and experiences of what it's like to be an ethnic minority in Australia. It may also be helpful to develop and translate brief information booklets, which should contain definitions of child abuse and neglect that child protection authorities use. Some of the usual institutional processes and procedures that the child protection system will use with an explanation for why, and examples so that all families, regardless of their cultural background, can see and relate to the kinds of scenarios that would cause them to enter the child protection system. It would also be useful to include a list of early intervention and preventative services that families can access to address family dysfunction before it possibly escalates into a child protection matter. Finally, it's important for agencies to actively develop and continuously maintain links with relevant community, ethnic or religious groups in the local area. Okay, now looking at 6 recommendations for the child protection system itself. The first is the need to develop 2 types of programs, a mainstream model and a multicultural model. According to Babakan, a mainstream program of service delivery is one that is delivered as part of core business but targets specific cultural groups. The benefit of this is that ethnic minority families perceive that they are receiving an integrated and therefore seamless service in which culture is not seen as a marginalised issue. She also argues that such a model is often seen by ethnic minority families as better resourced. Babakan also argues that it's important to develop culturally tailored programs, and there are 2 such types of multicultural programs. One is ethno-specific services, which target specific ethnic groups, and the other is multicultural services, which service culturally diverse communities. So having these kinds of multicultural units can streamline the process of accessing culturally appropriate information, but it can also increase the visibility of the efforts of child protection agencies to address cultural issues for ethnic minority families in terms of cultural knowledge and bridging across diverse groups. Finally, she argues that there's a need to ensure a bridge between the mainstream unit and the multicultural unit to ensure that culture, ethnicity and language are neither under or over-emphasised to the exclusion of other important factors like class, gender, ability, sexuality or spatial or geographical location. Other responsibilities of head office include that they provide ongoing training to all staff in cultural competency, especially in response to new and emerging communities in the child protection system, but also because of the high staff turnover due to professional burnout. So providing continual training and refreshers is important. It's also important because cultural competency is not just something that once you achieve it, you can say that you've got it. It's an ongoing process, not an attainable state. Child protection authorities should also review their risk of harm assessment tools that gauge the strengths and needs of various ethnic minority families, and they should consult with local ethnic community leaders and groups to ensure that those items are culturally appropriate and sensitive. It is important to make relevant policies widely available to caseworkers and case managers and therefore easy to access and refer to. So these can include things like anti-racist and anti-discriminatory policies, multicultural policies, equal employment opportunity policies, etc. Monitoring and routinely collecting data on indicators of ethnicity, which Jathinder has pointed out already, like country of birth, cultural ancestry, languages, religion and so on, are all important for improving the accountability and performance management of the child protection system. And finally, developing, also another very important one, developing outreach programs to provide community education and increase awareness in various ethnic communities about the role of child protection agencies and just child protection issues more generally. This can help minimise the possibility that ethnic minority groups unaware of the role and statutory power of child protection authorities may come to be later overrepresented in the child protection system. As one caseworker in the interview said, NESB communities aren't aware that we can remove children until we actually tell them. So a lot of the time they're giving really honest answers. They give enough information to remove the child because they don't understand the process. If they know you're going to take their kid, they're going to alter their responses, just like Anglo families and Aboriginal families do, because they're clearly aware of DOCS's role. In years to come, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these new and emerging communities are overrepresented in the DOCS system. They've got no concept of the appropriateness of their responses and of our role, and as much as we explain that to them, it's just not familiar. So in conclusion, this presentation has used various sources, including the voices of CAL families, caseworkers and case managers, to meet the aim of this presentation, which is to identify key issues relevant to the provision of culturally appropriate child protection services in culturally diverse communities. And from this, the overarching conclusion is that if you implement a culturally competent service from both the top and bottom, then you provide a structured, whole-of-system approach to the delivery of services that address cultural diversity. This helps ensure that all families, whether you are from the majority group or from any of the minority groups, are receiving a service that is culturally appropriate. And if a service is culturally appropriate, then this is the best gauge for ensuring equity in the protection of children from harm. In the words of Mason and colleagues, professionals who do not constructively engage with difference, and by this we mean from an assumption of equality and non-pathology, significantly lessen the chances of developing creative ways of working with people both within and across cultures. Engaging with difference enables us to explore the ties that bind and the ties that separate. Practitioners will then be enabled to develop cultural competency and thus play a positive role in eradicating racism and promoting and valuing diversity. Okay, that's it. I hope I made my time.